Bear and Bull. Three teams, A, B, and C. We were the C team. Sanjo, me, the film crew, and Holly, led by Zopa, Yogi, and Yash. I guess the brothers had not hitched a ride to find a job on the mountain. They already had a job. Zopa had hired them to help him get Sanjo to the summit. And I think the C stood for covert, not third, meaning secret, because we were getting the first summit shot, not the last. And somehow we were supposed to keep all of this quiet. The night before, Josh and Thaddeus hadn't told us to outright lie to the other climbers, but they came pretty close to it. We'll have to keep this to ourselves, Thaddeus had said, lowering his voice despite the fact that it was 10 degrees below zero outside and the wind was howling down the mountain at about 25 miles an hour. It wasn't likely someone was standing outside the flap eavesdropping. Thaddeus is right, Josh agreed. Some of the other climbers are real head cases. There'll be a fight over who goes first. It's ridiculous, but it's the same every year. They can't get it into their oxygen-starved brains that reaching the summit has nothing to do with the order you climb. It depends on the weather. Josh was messing up a little. Sitting at base camp or up at ABC, waiting your turn, increases your chances of catching a virus or twisting an ankle, to say nothing of the sheer boredom and psychological damage of lying in your cramped tent day after day, wondering if you're going to make it to the top. We were getting the first shot because of my birthday, period. It could take every one of those 30 plus days to get me to the top before I turned 15. In case anyone asks, Thaddeus said, this is what we're doing. He looked at the film crew. You're making a documentary about Sherpas. He looked at Holly. You're writing a story about Sherpas. He looked at me. You're just tagging along to help with the filming. As far as anyone knows, a summit attempt is not part of the documentary. Sandra's going to have to move to the Porter camp tonight, Josh said. It's the only way we can keep him under wraps. You can arrange that, Zopa. Can you arrange that, Zopa? Zopa nodded. Josh looked at Sanjo. Captain Shek and the soldiers rarely go to the porter camp, but just to be safe, you need to dress and act like a porter. No fancy Western climbing clothes. The porters are hauling supplies up the mountain the day after tomorrow. You'll all go with them. When you get to intermediate camp, out of sight of the Chinese, you can change into your climbing gear. When you come back down, you'll need to change your clothes and stick with the porters. If Shek catches you, you're toast. Toast? Sanjo asked. You'll be chipping boulders into gravel, I explained. Oh, a look of dread crossed Sanjo's usually calm and cheerful face. Sorry, a look of dread crossed Sanjo's usually calm and cheerful face. So, Josh continued, Zopa will lead the C team, I'll lead the A team, and Pasang will lead the B team. I was disappointed that I wouldn't be trying for the summit with my father, but I wasn't surprised. Change of plans had been the theme of our relationship my whole life. I was also worried about Zopa and Sanjo. Paranoia feeds on thin air. That's a direct quote from one of Josh's climbing books, and the feeling was beginning to gnaw at my guts. With Sanjo in the mix, it seemed to me that he and Zopa had everything to gain if I didn't make it to the summit. I'm not saying that they could try to stop me, but even the slightest mistake, accidental or intentional, could end my climb, and no one would be the wiser. Bad things happen on the mountains. It's part of every climb. And when something goes wrong, it's usually blamed on bad equipment, bad weather, bad luck, rarely on climbers themselves. Any questions? Josh asked. I had a couple dozen questions, like if Zopa could get forged papers good enough to get Sanjo over the Friendship Bridge, why should we trust his tattered birth certificate? He could be 6 months younger than me for all we know. For all we knew. Zopa knew exactly when my birthday was. He was there when Mom radioed Josh on Annapurna. Was Josh hedging his bets by sending Sanjo up with me? If I didn't make it, Josh's company would still receive the credit for getting the youngest climber to the top of Mount Everest. Sanjo was on his climbing permit. Did it really matter to Josh which one of us made it to the top? But I didn't ask questions or even make a comment. I was so confused and mad. I didn't trust myself to open my mouth. There's no way we'll be able to keep this a secret from the other climbers, JR said. There's only one final approach to the summit, and we'll all be taking it single file like ants. Josh gave him the grin. No worries. Once the A and B team get to Camp 4, the only thing they'll be thinking about is where their next breath is coming from. What about when they get back to base camp? JR asked. If they get to the summit, they won't care who made it to the top and who didn't, Josh answered. The important thing is to give them a good chance. Your team will be 4 or 5 days ahead of A and B. When you get above Camp 4, be careful what you say on the radio. One slip of the tongue, and everyone on this side of the mountain will know what we're up to. When you pass us up on your way down, don't say anything about the summit. We'll sort it out later. The other climbers are done with their second trip to ABC, JR persisted. They're at least a week ahead of us in terms of acclimatization. He was right. The third trip to ABC was when you usually tried for the summit. We were a trip behind Josh's other climbers. If the weather breaks our way, we'll try to get them to the top sooner, Josh said. If not, they'll have to wait it out in base camp, along with everyone else. We can't all head to the top at the same time. There isn't enough room. Which meant the other climbers could be sitting at base camp for another 6 weeks before getting their shot at the summit, and I knew that would not sit well with them. I had a lousy night lying in my sleeping bags, thinking of all the ways Zopa and Sanjo could sabotage my summit try if they wanted to. It was depressingly a long list. Late the next morning, when I finally poked my head out of my tent, a light snow was falling. I got dressed and went over to the mess tent, where I found Zopa and the film crew talking quietly about the shift in the documentary. Or were they talking about me until they saw me walk up? Josh was sure right about that thin air paranoia thing. Are you sick again? Zopa asked. Don't you wish, I thought, but told him that I had never felt better in my life. He didn't look like he believed me. I dished up a bowl of oatmeal, then took a seat at the table next to them. We had the tent to ourselves except for the cook cleaning up after the breakfast rush. As soon as you finish eating, JR said, I'll show you how to use the camera. Why? Because there's a decent chance that Jack, Will, and I won't make it to the summit. Someone has to get it on film. They were all strong climbers. It hadn't occurred to me that they might not make it to the top. We'll try, Jack said, but you never know. This is my third trip to Everest, JR said. The closest I've gotten was just above Camp 6. The weather turned us back, and that was it. I'll give you one of our mini cameras. He looked at his watch. We'll meet you and Zopa outside HQ in 15 minutes, then head over to the Porter camp to shoot some footage. They got up and left the tent. I looked at Zopa. Have you seen Josh? He took some of his team up the mountain to practice climbing techniques. I must have looked a little annoyed because Zopa studied me for a moment, then said, How do you feel about your father now that you have spent time with him? I haven't really spent much time with him, I answered, dodging the question. Zopa sipped his tea, then said, He can't help himself, you know. What do you mean? In climbing, he has found something he is very good at, something he has a passion for. Not many men find that. But what do you do when you get too old to climb mountains? Zopa laughed. Most climbers do not get old. You did. I stopped climbing. Why? My children were grown. I no longer needed the money. You must have climbed for more than money. Of course, but if I wasn't paid, I would not have climbed at all. You climb for sport. Sherpas climb to support their families. So you're here to help Sanjo become a Sherpa, I said. No, I'm here so Sanjo does not have to become a Sherpa. What do you mean? I know you're angry at me for not telling you about my plan for Sanjo, and you're upset with Sanjo for not telling you that I'm his grandfather. What does that have to do with your not wanting Sanjo to become a Sherpa? To get him this far, there were things I had to keep to myself, things I asked Sanjo to keep to himself. He really didn't know what I had in mind until I told him at ABC. I could not tell him until I saw how he did on the mountain. If he makes it to the summit, the notoriety, publicity it brings him will allow him to go back to school. I'm hoping he never has to climb again. Is that birth certificate real? Yes, Sanjo is a week older than you. What if I make it to the summit too? Zopa shrugged. This was not the answer I was hoping for. I know what you're thinking, I said. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Zopa smiled and got up from the table. I'll see you over at HQ. I'm going to make it to the summit, I told him as he walked out of the mess tent. In a strange way, the conversation helped me to center me. It reminded me that climbing, even though there might be other people in your party, um, climbing is a solo sport. Your legs, your arms, your muscles, your endurance, your will are yours alone. A partner can encourage you, maybe even stop you from falling, but they can't get you to the top. That's entirely up to you. I finished my breakfast feeling a little better and walked over to HQ to meet the film crew. Zopa was there, but Holly wasn't. She's already over at the Porter camp, JR explained. Dr. Krieger had some meds for Sanjo, but didn't want to take them to the camp herself. Captain Shek would find that suspicious. Doctors do not treat porters. Holly took them over for her. I guess I wasn't the only one being transformed by the mountain. Holly had undergone a remarkable change since we got up to ABC, and it was clear by JR's attitude that I wasn't the only one to notice. Her voice was still a little shrill, and she still wore her garish clothes, but she had taken care of me at ABC, and now she was looking after Sanjo. I don't I don't think she would have done that the first day she got to base camp. JR handed me a small camera about the size of a sandwich. I know it doesn't look like much, he explained, but it's reliable at high altitudes and it takes pretty good video. Not as good as the one we've been using, but hauling the big unit to the summit is a pain in the, you know. He showed me how to zoom in and out, how to frame a shot, how to use the built-in microphone, and how to change the memory card, which held about an hour of video. You have to be pretty close to pick up a voice, Jack explained, especially if the wind's blowing. Whoever's talking will probably have to shout. Consider the camera yours until the climb is over, JR said. We have another one we'll take to the top if we make it that far. You need to practice with it. The hardest part is hitting the little buttons with gloves on, so practice with gloves. If you take off your gloves above Camp 5, your fingers will fall off, and you'll be pushing buttons with your nose for the rest of your life. Pleasant thought. What am I supposed to be filming? I asked. The story, Will said. What story? That's the big question, JR answered, and part of the fun. And the mystery, Jack added. Josh hired us to film you, JR continued. Now Sanjo's been added to the mix, which changes the story if you and Sanjo don't make it to the summit. The story will shift again. It might be about how you didn't make it, what stopped you. It might be about the friendship between you two, which was pretty shaky at the moment, but I didn't tell JR that. Or Sanjo and Zopa, or you and your father. The point is, we won't know what the story is about until we know how the story ends. All we can do now is film details. When we get done, we'll piece the documentary together like a jigsaw puzzle, which is exactly how Vincent at GSS taught me to put a story together. He wouldn't let me write a word until I finished my research. Hold the story inside until you are ready to burst. He had me write my research notes on 3x5 cards. On each card was a scene, character note, or a detail from my research. When you do your research, write down whatever interests you, whatever stimulates your imagination, whatever seems important. A story is built like a stone wall. Not all the stones will fit. Some will have to be discarded, some broken and reshaped. When you finish the wall, it may not look exactly like the wall you envisioned, but it will keep the livestock in and the predators out. I wondered if Vincent would accept a documentary in place of a moleskin, but I doubted it. It would be great, JR continued, if you could write down your shots. It's not easy to do, especially at high altitudes, but it would help us when we edit. If you can't write them down, Jack suggested you can record what you're doing on the microphone. From a distance, the Porter camp looked neat and prosperous. But as we got closer, it became clear that it was neither. It seemed that everything in it was made out of cast-offs, things that were not wanted, as if the porters hung around after the climbing season and collected the leftovers from our camp and put it in theirs. There were a couple of shacks that had more flattened tin cans nailed to them than wood. The tents were sewn together from bits and pieces of other tents. The yak halters were made from frayed climbing ropes. The camp had a different smell to it as well. Dung, wood smoke, and the old palm oil that the porters cooked their food in. But the smell and disarray, the mess, were soon forgotten in the minor stampede of men that came running when they saw Zopa. Sanjo and Holly came out of a battered tent and joined us. Sanjo still looked pretty weak, which I wasn't unhappy to see. I wondered how he was going to do tomorrow when we headed back up to ABC. He pulled me to the side. I appreciate your standing up for me last night, he said. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Zopa. Forget it, I said, although I hadn't come close to forgetting it myself. How was it staying here last night? It's not as comfortable as the climbing camp, but the porters have been kind. The porters had lined up in a long row, and Zopa was walking down the line, greeting each in turn and giving blessings. When he finished, we sat down in a large circle on blankets and sleeping bags and talked, with Zopa translating. A good way to understand what the porters do for a living is to think of them as Himalayan truckers. The only difference is that their trucks have legs instead of wheels and are fueled by grass instead of diesel. The nearest restaurant to our cabin in Wyoming was a truck stop. Mom and I used to go there all the time and we loved it. The truckers were friendly, funny, and full of stories. It was no different with the porters. I got so involved in their stories, I completely forgot about using my camera. The porters were all from all over Tibet and Nepal and spent 9 months out of the year away from home. When they weren't hauling gear up Everest and other mountains, they were guiding truckers or moving supplies at lower altitudes. Most of the younger porters wanted to become climbing Sherpas because the money was better. The older porters seemed satisfied driving their yaks in spite of the hardships. They told us stories about falls and getting lost, but the most grim story was related at the end of the day by an old porter named Gulu, who was from the same village where Sanjo was born. Gulu knew Sanjo's mother well and claimed to have taken Sanjo on his first yak ride when he was a baby. The porters and Sherpas were spread out over thousands of barren miles, but there always seemed to be connections like this between them. On the way back to camp, JR said that Gulu's story was compelling, but he couldn't use it in the final documentary. No room. Which is why I included it here. Vincent taught me that what makes a story unique is not necessarily the information in the story, but what the writer chooses to put in or leave out. When Gulu was a young man, he bought a beautiful yak bull from a distant village. It had taken him 3 years to save the money for the bull, which he planned to use to increase the size of his small herd. It was a long distance to the village where the yak was being sold, Gulu said, shaking his gray head. The Chinese soldiers were everywhere, and it was dangerous on the road. I traveled at night and hid in the hills during the day so they did not rob or kill me. It took him so long to get to the village that he was afraid the bull would be gone when he got there, either sold to another buyer or killed by the soldiers for food. But the bull was there, he said, and more magnificent than I remembered. His hair was as dark as a moonless night. His back was as straight as a floor timber and as broad as I am tall. He laughed. The owner regretted the price we had agreed upon and tried to raise it. They argued for 3 days. In the end, Gulu gave the owner all the money he had and a promise to bring him the first 2 babies the bull produced the following year. All of this took too long, Gulu explained. The weather had turned bad. To complicate things, I now had a yak with me that had been pastured for over a year with very little exercise. He was weak in the legs from being penned. I had to stop often for him to rest and eat. The other difficulty was that I had no money, and I myself had to scavenge for food. He decided the only way he would make it home before he and the yak starved was to take a shortcut through the mountains. He had heard about the shortcut, but had never traveled it. At first, the route was good. It was far enough from the roads so that I could travel during the day without fear of soldiers. Then the path started to rise. The weather worsened the higher we climbed. The snow was deep. I should have turned back, he grinned and shrugged. But I was young and foolish, and I continued to climb, driving the bull before me. They reached the shortcut summit and started down the other side, Gulu confident now that he and the bull were going to make it home safely. But as he was looking for a place to sleep, an avalanche roared down the mountain and buried him alive. I was so cold, Gulu said with a shudder. More cold than I had ever been in my life, before or since. I remember thinking how unfair it was that the avalanche hadn't killed me when it struck. I waited for death in that cold, dark place, wondering how long it would be. After a while, I felt a tugging on my right arm like a fish nibbling on bait. At first, I didn't know what it was. Then I remembered the bull. When we reached the summit, I had put a rope around his neck and kept him close. It wasn't a long rope, 2 meters, 2 yards, maybe a little shorter. He was close and he was alive, but was he above me or below? The snow was so tight around me, I didn't know if I was face down or face up. I could have been standing on my feet for all I knew, or upside down on my head. We all laughed, but being buried alive isn't funny. I am not sure why, Gula continued, but it seemed important to reach the bull, to touch him one last time, to apologize for taking him from the safety of his pasture. I started to pull myself along the rope. It was slow and painful work. The farther I got up the rope, the harder the yak pulled, sometimes smashing my face into the ice before I could clear it away. Perhaps the bull is free, I thought, standing on the surface, tethered by the man beneath. I finally broke through, gasping for breath. The bull was on the surface, but he was not standing. As I examined him, he kicked me several times, but I was so numb I barely felt it. My beautiful bull had 2 broken legs. I felt shards of bone sticking through his flesh. There was only one thing to do. I unsheathed my knife and cut his throat. The bull took a long time to bleed out. Gulu watched with tears freezing to his cheeks. 3 years of hard work and sacrifice lay at his feet, bleeding into the snow. But there was no time for sorrow, he told us. I had to get back to my village. If I didn't, my family would have to pay the debt of the 2 calves. But first, I had to survive the night. He slit the yak open, pulled his guts out onto the snow, then climbed into the body cavity to warm himself. Early the next morning, my sleep was interrupted by a violent shaking. I thought the yak was slipping down the mountain. I put my head outside the carcass, the body of the bull or the yak, and I don't know who was more surprised, I or the bear pulling my precious bull down the mountainside. It reared up on its hind feet and let out a heart-stop bellow that shook every bone in my body. I was certain I would be eaten, but I was saved by the Chinese army. 4 soldiers had been tracking the bear and caught up to it just as it bellowed. They fired and missed, but the bullets were enough to frighten the bear away. It lumbered up the slope and disappeared into the trees. All I had to do now was contend with the soldiers, Gulu said. But I didn't think this would be a problem. I had no money. If they wanted the yak for food, they were welcome to it. As they reached the carcass, the body of the bull, I crawled out of my bloody shelter. When they saw me, the soldiers screamed like frightened children and threw down their rifles. Before I could speak, they ran away. After Gulu returned home, he heard a rumor about 4 soldiers coming across a yeti feeding on a yak. A few weeks later, there was a story about a cow giving birth to a full-grown man. How did you pay for the calves? JR asked. Gulu smiled. I sold the soldiers' rifles. There was enough money to pay for the calves and to buy a new bull. He was not nearly as magnificent as the one that gave birth to me, but he was a good breeder and increased my small herd tenfold. So okay, there was a lot going on in this, but it was actually pretty cool, right? It's we're getting to know Peak the writer right now. Like, we're getting to see how much Peak actually is talented, or why he belongs at GSS. On top of that, he shares his paranoia. Like, he's suspecting Sanjo and Zopa of doing him dirty, and now he's like, well, can I trust him? Can I not trust him? Like, for the most part, he was leaning toward not, until Zopa finally told him, like, look, straight up, I need to make sure Sanjo can go back to school. Like, who doesn't want that for their kids, right? And on top of that, they live in a place where he's not a free Tibetan, and if the Chinese catch him, he's going to be basically a prisoner. And And that's not the life that Zopa wants for him. Zopa wants him to be successful, doesn't want him to sacrifice himself for his sisters, which is a kind thing for him to do at 14 years old. Can you imagine deciding you're going to give up your future so that your sisters can be successful? Because otherwise, you know, they're not going to be, because of where you live. Think about that. Like, connected to Malala. This is why Malala fought for education for everyone. This is why we, your teachers here at your school, tell you, you know, for those of you that are taking it for granted, there are places right now where education isn't a right or a freedom. And so, yes, some of the stuff that we have to do is work and it stinks, but you have to think of like the benefits you're gonna get in the end. Remember benefit costs from economy? I had to include that in there. Anyway, just this chapter was, even though it was a little long, there's so much going on. It kept it interesting. I know the other chapter that we read that was a little long. That one was a lot of details. I'll give you that one. But this one has so much in it that it's bearable. You can feel it. You can feel the emotion that he has when he's talking to Zopa. You can feel the emotion that he took from Gulu's story. Like, you definitely, in the text, it's visible. And I mean, we're in his notebook, so we're getting to know Peak more. And Zopa asks him, getting pretty intense. Zopa asks him, how does he feel about his dad? Well, you know what? He has not had experience with his dad. And finally, someone asked him, and finally he answered out, you know, like, he doesn't really have a choice on like his feelings about his dad. He doesn't have time with him. Even though he does want it, he does. You could tell he wants it. He says his little sentences that he puts out there, his little statements that he puts out there, he does want it. All right, guys, go ahead and fill out your forms. Obviously, I want you to know that this, to me, for me as your teacher, because this is one of my favorite books, it's more than filling out the Google Forms. It's for you to enjoy the story along the way. So try your best, and we'll talk. Bye.